Hi, and welcome to episode 21 of Differential Diagnosis, the podcast where we differentially diagnose every single episode of House and beyond. In this episode, we're looking at the season finale of Season 1. That's Season 1, Episode 22, Honeymoon. My name is Harvey, and joining me this week, as with every other week, is your co-host Gaz.
Hey, pleasure to be here once again. 22 episodes down the line. Looking forward to assessing what I think is the season 1 epilogue, not necessarily the climax. So
yeah, that's Gaz's theory. He's going to run with it. He's going to explore it. That he thinks that the emotional climax came last week.
Yeah,
because much like me, House likes to climax early.
Oh, that's very revealing. I'm sure all of our listeners are interested and have now had their queries satisfied regarding your sexual performance. But you know, I will never reveal that sort of data because it's no one's goddamn business.
So yeah, well, moving on, we've made it to the end of season 1. We will be doing a season 1 overall summary, but hey, we're on the final episode. We're going to look into it, and it's a big one. It's, a lot has led to this moment, a lot of subtle hints. This is the big payoff where we see the mysterious character of Stacey finally out from behind the curtain. So, Gaz, if you give us a synopsis of the episode?
Well, of course. As always, I provide us with a little synopsis, powered by house.fandom.com. Those little knowledge gnomes that scuttle away, typing up all the information we need to know, and that we convey to you in various different forms. And I guess this time round, it's going to be a synopsis. So here we go. Honeymoon is the first season finale episode of House, which first aired on May 24th, 2005. House's ex-girlfriend, Stacey Warner's husband, Mark, is reluctant to be treated by House, but they eventually corral him and get him into the hospital. Although Mark insists he is fine and the initial tests bear him out, it is soon clear that there is something seriously wrong with him. House is torn emotionally between wanting to please Stacey by curing Mark and letting Mark die, either so she might come back to him or to hurt her for the way she hurt him. The matter only gets worse when the only way to confirm House's diagnosis is to risk Mark's life.
What drama awaits us? Well, let's find out as we differentially diagnose Season 1, Episode 22, Honeymoon. It's an unconventional episode because it's the season finale, the first season finale. It's introducing a pretty big plot with Stacey. It's had an unconventional setup where she previously had asked him to see her husband as a patient, so that's not usual to how House finds patients. So, to fit this unconventional episode, we have an unconventional opening where it's House and Stacey in a restaurant. I think this is the first time where we've really had a cold open where it's not a cold open, it's a hot open because we know all the characters involved. And they're sitting at dinner, waiting for Stacey's husband to turn up. And Stacey's husband doesn't want to turn up, and they're having a discussion. Stacey's paranoid. She thinks that him being scared of House is a symptom. House is still underplaying it still. He kind of thinks that he's not really sure of Stacey's motivations because the husband doesn't feel outwardly sick. And then it turns out that she's lied to her husband and told him that House won't be at dinner.
Also, very strange, creepy, flirty moment where House goes towards like Stacey's wearing a crucifix and the Jesus is facing towards her chest. He goes over to the necklace and then goes, he likes to see near like her cleavage, basically, and puts Jesus back in place. That's a really creepy, and she's kind of into it. I was a bit like, ugh.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's a bit cringy, but I guess at the very least it shows that there's a sexual attraction between them, like which makes sense given their background, and I like the show isn't ignoring it. It's not like Stacey's. I think that's what makes Stacey feel like quite a well-realized person, even though they have a history. Like they're both being quite civil, they're both being a bit playful. It's not like Stacey's turned up and House is just furious at her, or Stacey hates House. They're being, reasonably civil to each other, which I think immediately helps bolster the relationship and kind of get their flirtation and potential, and the drama between them started. We don't have to really get over a lot of there's kind of they have a history and she's responsible for House's pain, and that's kind of subtext there, but it's not the full text. It's not just them arguing about that.
Yeah. Also, this opening scene is a little bit psychotic on a number of levels. Firstly, they're openly discussing that the husband should be taken to hospital immediately in front of him. And then they're having a bit of Stacey says, a bit of a pissing contest over the threesome between Stacey and House and Mark. Like, who loves her more? Who's the more competent or more loved partner? And then House spikes Mark. There's just so many wrong things going on all at the same time.
Oh yeah, but a lot of that is House's plan, because House has spiked his drink.
That's what I mean.
He's called the ambulance beforehand, and all House has to do is get him to drink. So I guess House quickly realizes that he's not going to get the guy to relax. So instead, he turns it into like a weird drinking competition where he's like, cheers. And then like he starts to down his pint, and then Mark starts to down his pint. I think the House recognizes pretty early on that Mark is a very competitive guy and like really plays him. It's very funny. But I agree, it's like totally insane. But then at the end, there's this revelation that it was all part of a plan, which I quite like.
But it was all kind of crazy because the whole centerpiece of their discussion, them meeting up for the first time, was to say, hi, here's my husband. I want him to go to hospital now. He doesn't think he's unwell. Well, I think he's unwell. Blah, blah. And I just don't know. It's just mad.
Yeah, I guess. Because, the conversation was presumably to have like a civil discussion about his symptoms and if he's feeling all right. But because Mark comes in and denies it, it just turns into get him into the hospital immediately. Because outwardly, Mark doesn't think he has a problem, which means it's a very strange episode because it's very much, Stacey sort of observing that there's something wrong with her husband subtly. I mean, you could make the argument that, maybe she wants to get in touch with House, and so she's reading in that it's this medical mystery that no one can solve. Because, on the outside, Mark seems fine. There doesn't seem to be a huge problem, but she's very insistent he be treated by House under the guise of this illness is so mysterious that, no one else can figure out what it is. And the assumption is never there's nothing wrong. It's House must be involved. So it's never really brought up because they do have marriage problems, but they come from the illness, not from her. Like, it doesn't feel like marriage problems inspire her to track down House. It's more like, tracking down House therefore causes the marriage problems because of the illness. So I wouldn't. It's weird. That's a potential read of it, but it's never brought up overtly that Stacey might actually be overreading these symptoms because subconsciously she wants to see House again. But so if we take it as read that Mark is sick, he must be quite sick if Stacey wants him to go to hospital. But because we don't know Mark, it's quite interesting because we're sort of put in House's and everybody's shoes, and even Mark's shoes, that we just see a totally healthy guy just sitting in a hospital bed, and Stacey's the only one saying he is really ill.
There's a really effective interaction between Wilson and House, where Wilson kind of dissects House's motivations despite House's protestations. where he says, well, you think that you're going to save Mark and then win back Stacey. And he said, well, he's married, so I pretty much lost that game. He doesn't really deny his desire, if that makes sense. He just says, I do, but that's not going to happen. He's married. She's married now.
I think that's a lot of that's a lot of why I like this episode. Like we've talked consistently throughout the season about that House's motivations are often quite hard to work out because he is by his nature a very deflective, paradoxically speaking man. He will muddy the waters for his own benefit so that people can't read him. I think, well, firstly, it's nice that Wilson is once again the only person who is concerned about House and, comes up to him and says, look, I don't want you making any bad decisions. But at the same time, it's because Wilson knows that House can't really handle this, but everyone else does because of the front that House puts on. But also, I think that leads to a lot of the intrigue of the episode. As you say, it's House saying, oh, I've already lost. He's kind of acting like, he's not interested in Stacey, that he's just there to mess with her. He's enjoying messing with Mark. And you can't tell, like, is he messing with Mark because he wants to break them up or just because he wants to mess with Stacey as some sort of punishment? So it's I'd say that's a lot of the episode's like kind of intrigue between Stacey and House, using Mark as kind of a pawn in their game. But it's but it's nice because I do think that then comes down to I think that is revealed at the end. There's a moment where after all the moments where, House is sort of diagnosing her, he's saying like, oh, you haven't had any, of your friends over. Maybe any of your old friends from town haven't come over. Maybe if they knew they were here, they might question you about your motives. Maybe they'd warn you about falling in love with me. Because he says, Wilson's warning me about that. And so they have this, constant back and forth with this. And then there's that moment at the end where Stacey comes into the office and she says, you were the one who got away. And you can kind of see, even though I suspect House has been playing a very coy game where he's been sort of kind of trying to get underneath Stacey's skin to admit that she has feelings for him, but he's kind of doing it on the guise of it being a game. When she tells him that, she doesn't say she'll get back with him. Obviously, she says, like, I'm married. But she, she kisses him and she's like, I will always love you. And there's that moment where, you can tell that she's broken through the shell, like his guys falls away. It's a very nice moment.
You're missing one crucial detail, which is that she says that she can't stand being with him. That's pretty much, she's like, I love you, but no way. I can't stand being with you. That's, to me, the big kind of crucial detail of it. Just delving a little bit closer in, there's a really nice moment where they're sitting next to each other, and all of the dialogue in this like specific scene early on, around about like 7 minutes in, it's House brings her a cup of coffee, says milk no sugar. She says, well, I like sugar now, as if to say I've changed, and I don't necessarily like she's proving a point that she's changed and that things are different now. And then they're sitting down and he's just like constantly bouncing his walking stick as if dangling like the consequences of her actions, which he is still resentful of, in front of her, saying, she says, some people might find that annoying. And it's all those interesting subtext to the conversation, which is really nicely written and kind of really brings out the relationship, or at the attempts at trying to navigate or do battle with each other. She says, I've changed. He says, he's like, here's my stick, the stick you maybe need to walk around. It's very nicely written, and I think it also is very well acted by Celia Ward and Hugh Laurie as well.
Do you also like I think this episode does a good job of, because we know that there's this ongoing thing about like how much House has changed, and in the last episode where we were talking about Gregory, House in short, Stacey in this episode is asked by Cameron, has House changed? And she said, no, he was pretty much the same. Whereas in a previous episode in Detox, Wilson confronts House that he has changed. And my sum up of why I think there's this disconnect is that because Wilson's actually seen House over the last 5 years and Stacey hasn't, I think Stacey, when she comes into House's life, House starts, she sort of brings him to life and he starts acting a lot like how he did. So I think that's why, because you can see from their interactions, he's a lot more smiley, he's a lot more laughy, he's a lot more lighthearted. I think that she thinks, from her observations, that House hasn't changed that much, even though from everyone else's position he has. So I think that's quite interesting that it gives Stacey a unreliable narrator position in that constant question of how has House changed. But no, the thing I was going to say was, as you said with the discussion they have in the office where she says, I can't stand you, I quite like that it sort of bleeds into that has House changed, because House is pretty unbearable to be around from the looks of things. Yeah. And it's quite nice that even though it's kind of framed like they had a great relationship and then it fell apart because of the leg, but as you say, it's this, she's like, oh, sometimes I can't stand you. And it's so you start to really think, would their relationship have lasted even with the leg? You start to see that, this romance might have not been quite so perfect. If House really is the way he is constantly, he's obsessive, he sort of gets depressed, you start to think oh, maybe actually there might have been some problems deep down. But I don't know, maybe unless you have a different interpretation on that, but I just think I quite like the way it kind of shows that it wasn't quite the perfect romance that's worthy of destroying someone's life that it was made out to be.
Yeah. There's also an interesting interaction between Cameron and Stacey as well. Because they talk about his leg and what happened, because I think this is before 3 stories, and then that happens, and Cameron asks, what was he like before his leg, as if as a big event, and he said, it's just the same person, really. And that's a bit hang on, really? What's going on here?
Well, yeah, that's what that's why I think that Stacey has a bad read on the situation. I think, but that conversation also leads into, because they're talking about the date that Cameron went on, and it leads into this kind of this other question of, can House be in love with someone, which kind of we saw with Cameron earlier on, when they went on that date and it fell apart. And you even get some confirmation from Cameron that it didn't go well. It wasn't a good date. Because they don't really, you kind of see the beginnings of a bad date, but you don't ever hear anyone confirm that it was really bad.
Yeah.
But it's, do you want to go into the kind of the Cameron arc here? Because that question's kind of brought up again, and through his interactions with Stacey, we sort of have that question answered finally.
Yeah. So as everybody's watched the previous episodes, we get this idea that Cameron likes House and is hoping or anticipating that's reciprocated. And so, the key question is, given House's strange, how to put it, strange interactions with Cameron, taking her out monster trucking, begging her to come back, you think maybe there's some sort of romantic threesome between them. And then they go on a date. The date kind of ends kind of terribly, I guess. For Cameron anyway, for House, it kind of resolves an issue. And then there's the interaction between Cameron and Stacey, where she finally is searching for the answer of what's going on. Why didn't this work? Was I bad, or was I deficient, or does he not like anybody? And I think really, at the end of the day, House doesn't like Cameron like that, but House does like other people, So therefore, it was really just a mismatch between the two of them, not necessarily of all people. And we get that question at the end, which I think is a nice closure to that arc. It kind of doesn't end with, oh, if you can love Stacey, then you obviously love me too, right? And then the date was just a big fat mistake, and it all went wrong, and now we can have it all right again. And actually, no, it kind of ends on a bum note, just very low key. House is standing there, kind of in his like emotional paralysis mode, while Cameron opens up her, kind of finds out this problem that they had.
Yeah, she kind of monologues and resolves her own feelings there and then, while House just sort of stares at her, which is
typical House.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there could be an argument made that it could be the case that actually it's not even like necessarily Cameron. It's just that House is so fixated on Stacey that Stacey's the only person he'll ever want. Because there's this, Stacey says the phrase, you were the one that got away. Even though she's married to Mark and she wants to stay with him, she openly acknowledges that House might have been, kind of her soulmate in a way. Not that the show would ever really, I mean more in the casual way than their actual souls bound to each other, that kind of thing. But it's but yeah, I think that could work with House as well. It's not even that Cameron wouldn't be a good partner for him. It's just that Stacey is so perfect for him that he just can't even focus on any other woman. Like Stacey's the only person he'll ever want, and he's just still in mourning for her. So maybe if House had never met Stacey, he would want Cameron. So, but thankfully she does give up at this point and stop trying that, so we don't have to deal with that for the next
But it's
seasons.
also very rewarding in a strange way that did not happen, because that's what you expect, and that didn't happen. It's not subverting expectation. It's kind of just going against the grain a little bit, and it's quite pleasant for me. There are all these other little details as well in the interactions between Stacey and House, where House is brooding on a rooftop, which is like a kind of a cliche of medical procedurals. Like they're in a difficult situation, they go to the rooftop and they think about it. It's like a Scrubs where they find that toilet on the rooftop, I think it's on the rooftop, where they just sit there and they have epiphanies on the toilet. And I guess it's that thing. But that trope aside, they meet each other again. They have an argument over House kind of provoking Mark by asking all these weird questions. And then Stacey says, "Oh, you're doing as you usually do. You go up on the roof and mope about things after you've done, you've messed with people." And he says, "I haven't been there for 5 years." She doesn't know any different about how he is or what he is now. But she sees habitual behaviour that she saw before 5 years ago and expects that it's always been the same since. But actually he changed. And the moment he came back, he regressed.
Which I think bleeds into that her saying, "Oh yeah, House was pretty much the same point." Because but yeah, as you say, it's there are all these nice moments where they're, House is there to comfort her. She's always like going to House after every problem. She's not going to Mark, and I think that says a lot. And then you have these nice moments where, as you say, she's like observes that he's on the rooftop like he always does, and he's like, "I haven't been up here in 5 years," and you see like all the little tiny minute ways that Stacey might have affected House. Like you have to wonder, why hasn't he been up to the roof? Is it because his leg hurts to go up there? And now that Stacey's there, he's falling back into all these like behavioral patterns. And I don't even know if the rooftop scene is kind of like a self-aware joke that even like maybe 5 years ago House was living in a sort of like generic medical procedural where he was going up to the roof to think. And now and then as soon as Stacey as soon as he lost the use of his leg, then it stopped being that generic medical procedural.
Maybe I wouldn't go that far.
That might be
I think that's a bit too granular. But I think it's really interesting for the reason that for Stacey, time stopped for House in her mind for 5. It's as if time stopped, and she's just come back and it's all the same again. But it seems like House is always trying to conceal the fact that he's changed, and then he'll reveal it, and then there'll be a moment between them, and then he'll say, I haven't given up. And is it he hasn't given up on saving Mark, or is it I haven't given up on her? And I think that's the kind of ethical problem, is that we don't know that. It's deliberately vague. The subtext is all there, but what are you supposed to think as an audience member? Are both true at the same time?
Yeah. I'd say the most open House gets towards his feelings of curing Mark is there's that scene where it's I mean, this is important because House doesn't meet Wilson in the hospital. He calls Wilson to a bar late at night while Wilson's like having guests around. So it's at a point where Mark's conditions got really bad and he's going to die, and House just calls Wilson away from his home to a bar. He's drinking by himself, and he just tells Wilson that Mark's dying, and he felt bad because he didn't feel bad. He felt confused because the first feeling he thought was that he was happy, but he wasn't sure if he was happy because by Mark dying, it meant he could get with Stacey, or if Mark dying meant that he would, he could hurt Stacey. I think that's probably, like, as you say, like there's an uncertainty about how he's feeling because he's always hiding himself, and as an audience member that can be quite frustrating. But I think that moment in the bar, the fact that he's like drinking alone, he's called Wilson away from his house, he needs someone to talk to. And it's that's when he shares, I think, probably his most true feelings of the episode. And that only comes about when Mark's about to die and the situation's really getting real, and House is reflecting, do I want Stacey back or do I just want to punish her? Which has kind of been, we've kind of assumed that's kind of how House is feeling because of the way he's toying with both of them, but it's at that moment in the bar where we actually get insight into that, which then makes the ending even more crushing, because when Stacey then admits her feelings but Mark is alive, we get this reaction from House that makes me think that actually it was House wants to get back to Stacey. He's done with punishing her.
So they eventually diagnose him with acute intermittent porphyria, which is quite a horrific disease because it's something you can't really track all the way through. It's something that just comes in a seizure, and then that's the only time you can actually detect it, which is really interesting because it's kind of, there are neurological problems, you have skin problems, he becomes paralyzed at one point, but the only way to diagnose it is to extract either feces or urine, and then do a test, oxidate the urine so that it comes out as purple, and that means just shining light on it basically. And I actually think that the condition is also a metaphor for kind of Mark's hidden feelings about House and Stacey's relationship. It's like a kind of, he's always keeping people, there's those subtexts they always keep under wraps, but every so often with the right stimulant, there's a seizure, there's some sort of attack, there's some sort of event that happens that brings out the truth. And the only way you can know about it is if you are able to detect it, or it actually happens there and then. It's not something that's always underlying, it just comes and goes. And in the same way, House and Stacey are having that moment where they have this problem. The problem is that House and Stacey broke apart because of a lack of trust between them, that Stacey made a decision that affected him profoundly, and they broke up and nothing was really resolved. The moment they come together, everything just starts coming out into the open in a way that's much more explicit, and both of them are kind of seized up with their emotions regarding each other, and Mark is like a catalyst for that, because he is a catalyst for the plot, because without him, Stacey isn't there because he'd be sick. And I find it really interesting. And the condition has paranoia involved. It's mood swings, pain, abdominal pain, gut pain, neurological problems, etc. I guess there's a theme to be found in that diagnosis, I think, written into the show. And so it's really interesting because the only way they can kind of cure him is to stimulate an attack. So they give him a cocktail of drugs, which he is kind of refused. And House just goes, "Oh, F it." Ugh! Stabs him with it, creates the seizure. Everyone's panicking, like, "What the hell have you done, House? You might have killed this person."
Yeah, that's probably like the most, I'd say, like, upfront confrontational moment where House breaks the rules.
Yeah.
Because House has broken the rules several times, and like sort of people have disagreed, but they've never done anything. But this is all three doctors standing in front of him saying no, and House even makes the argument that, like, because Stacey wants it, he can break the law, and Stacey will make sure that Mark will never, get him sued or get his license revoked because he'll have proven himself right. So he kind of knows he has that safety net. But this is the one time that everyone stood up to him, and it's kind of like House is overtly, you can see the logic in it because he wants to do what Stacey wants, which I guess gives you good insight into how he's feeling about Stacey at that point. But it's also, I think it's probably the most insane that House has ever been, and it's when everyone's quite scared. And even while watching it, I was like, Jesus Christ, like I'm worried for what House is doing, because we all love the moments where House sort of like breaks the rules, but when he's standing in with a patient, like basically threatening him where the guy's paralyzed and pet, it's like, this is quite cruel.
Well, it's also interesting.
And there is quite a nice subtle thing as well in the order that people stand up to him. It's Foreman, then Cameron, then reluctantly Chase, which I find quite funny. But sorry, carry on with what you're saying.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that's quite fun, especially when Foreman kind of just stands in the way. It's like he's going to do him in if he tries. It's like, I'm standing in your way, we're not allowing it.
Yeah, and it's all very relevant to their characters and their whole... I'd say it's like the summation of their like kind of character arcs for the whole season. Even though it's a small thing, it's like Foreman is now... he's the most aggressive one. He's the most confident one, and he's the one who really is there to stand up to House. Cameron then steps in because she's a bit more confident now. She's willing because she wants to do the right thing. And then Chase is like, "Oh God, everyone else is doing this. I better do this as well."
Oh, Struth. It's kind of like Foreman always goes for the rational and does it on rational grounds, says, "Look, you can't do this. This is ethically bad." And then Cameron kind of appeals to House's emotions, says, "This is not good for the what if the patient dies? You'll create an emotional mess." And then Chase is like, Struth, I don't know." All right, then.
Chase doesn't even say anything, does he?
Do you care about your job?
He just...
But the other thing to note about that scene is it's kind of a weird inversion of House's predicament with his leg. The patient is saying, "No, I don't want this." Stacey is saying, "Please do this." And House is kind of having to, if you look at it through like parallels, he's having to be like Cuddy was and acquiesce to Stacey's pleas to save the patient.
True. Which the fact he does
himself,
kind of
like to say, "All right, I understand. I understand now why you did what you did. It was to save my life." And that's the moment of resolution to me for House, is that he starts to understand Stacey's values, and that it was never done out of malice. It was never done to harm House. It was always done to protect him. And that's, I think, something he never really came to terms with, as you can tell from like 3 stories, especially.
Yeah, which is kind of the culmination of, like, as you say, there's no, like, there's little disagreements between them, and he's like, will Mark ever forgive you? And she says, yes, he will. And there's all these kind of moments where they're going back and forth, and kind of the subtext is that he's still angry about the leg, but they never overtly say it. But it's this, but it's that moment where he kind of listens to Stacey and does what she wants, and you can tell in his mind in the next scene that he's kind of come to terms with it. It's quite interesting. As you say, it's like he has to relive his worst nightmare to understand why it happened. And then he comes to terms. It's quite therapeutic in that way.
You could see him struggling because he's just like, okay, I can't, he can't. The reason he says I can't do it is not anything really to do with his fellows. It's to do with him. He's saying I can't do it because it's like me doing the same thing. And he changes his mind, makes the decision. He sees in Mark a reflection of his own feelings about this when it happened, which is a very nice touch.
Absolutely. One of my I sort of noticed this when I was watching it again, and I'm not sure if I'm reading too much into this, but because House is someone who's prone to changing their mind anyway, so this might not have made a difference. Yeah. But what I like is there is a moment. So as Gaz said, there's loads of symptoms. There's a crazy number of symptoms, but the big symptom that gives it away is this neurological symptom, where House questions during a lie test. House questions Mark on him and Stacey's relationship, and Mark goes into this whole thing about that he's he took Stacey to Paris, which is a city that she'd always wanted to go to, but she never got to go. And that, and then obviously says that they had a pretty good honeymoon just to make House feel inadequate. So it then turns out later that that was actually a lie. And even though it didn't show up as a lie on the test, he wasn't using the right areas of his brain to lie. It turns out that actually that was a delusion of Mark's. And then that leads them on to the next symptom. But the nice moment is that the way that this is brought up, and I think this is brought up about as well as they could have done it, is that House mentions it to Stacey. He's like, Mark seems like a great guy. He took you to Paris after all. And that's when she goes, no, we've never been to Paris. And then they check through and they realize that actually Mark is delusional, which gives them another symptom. Yeah. But the thing I like about the moment is that House is kind of accepting. I know that he said that he's lost beforehand. He said, like, she's already married to Mark, so he's won. But it's the fact that he goes up to Stacey and he actually says, you know what, Mark is a great guy. I'm going to stop messing with you now. Like, he took you to Paris. He did something amazing for you. He helped you achieve a dream. And then she says, no, he didn't. Like, and then it gives them that like new symptom. But at the same time, it kind of then, I think it flicks a switch in House's mind, because House becomes then a lot more like pushy on Stacey again, possibly to like reignite that relationship. It's like he falls back into his bad habits, because it's like House has like a moment of clarity. He's like, Mark's a great guy. He did this for you. And then as soon as Stacey says, no, he didn't do that for me, House is like, oh my God, so he's not a great guy. Fantastic. I've still got a chance.
Well, didn't she say it was because she was really busy? She was the one who said, I was busy, I had work to do, so he stayed in New York for a bit.
Oh, yeah, but House doesn't hear those words,
Yes,
baby.
he does. Yes, he does.
House hears, Mark ain't taking you to Paris.
Okay, all right then.
I don't know. I do get that sense, because it's after that, then they have several more confrontations about it and about their relationship. And I do find it funny, that idea that House probably just reverts back. He's like, oh shit, maybe Mark isn't such a great guy. Fantastic.
I think it reveals more about your nature than House's.
That's very true.
But yes, what would I say about this episode? I think if I was to think that NBC wouldn't have renewed this, I would have said this would have been a very dark way to end, but also quite satisfying, because House has he's now faced his demons. He's faced the reason why he has he's faced the issues that he had with Stacey. He's faced his illness more directly, his leg, his disability more directly. It's also very dark and unsatisfying in the sense that he doesn't actually get what he wants. He only gets what he needs. See what I did there?
I did, but very fitting for the show at the very least. Like,
he gets his resolution, and if it was to end there, it would have been like a very bleak but satisfying end to the entire project. But no, it carries on. Because I guess the other point to make, is that at the end he has to contend with working with Stacey as a colleague, and you would think maybe in a different world where the house doesn't continue, you could imagine a world where he's just becoming a better person slowly as he has Stacey as a colleague, not as a partner, as it were, and tries to move on from what happened 5 years ago.
Yeah, because at the very least he would have Stacey in his life. Yeah. I think it's I agree with you. I think it's I mean, I'm glad it got more seasons, but on the whole, like, if it hadn't have been renewed, it you learn about the character, you learn about his conflicts, and there's sort of this quite depressing but at least satisfying, like, resolution where he grows in some way and changes his mind on his past and his ghosts, and there's hope for change, or if not, at least he's been through this sort of 5-year arc where he's sort of come to terms with something. I do think if it hadn't have been renewed, I think it would have been, as you say, it would have either been like nice that she's still working there because you could like assume that he's getting better and he's got Stacey in his life, or I think if they were not going to renew it, it would make sense to have Stacey not work there, because then you could end it clean. Yeah. And it could be like, House has had this moment with Stacey and everything's resolved. But obviously you have to have that Stacey is coming to work at the hospital thing, because I assume by this point they knew there was a season 2, because then that really sets up the whole drama of season 2. Because Stacey is kind of like the Vogler of season 2. Each season has each season is very much like has its little plot threads and its mysteries, but there's always like one big event. Yeah. And I think season 1 is Vogler, season 2 is Stacey, and then you have like season 3, which is Tritter and beyond. So I think the that Stacey being the next big boss for the next season is a good way to leave it off on. Yeah. Because their relationship is so good by the end, you're like, well, that's interesting now. Like, they don't have to resolve the bad bits of the relationship. Now they've only got the good bits, and what's going to happen there? How are they going to get through the temptation? Yeah. Especially when both characters have shared their feelings. Like, we know how House feels. We definitely know how Stacey feels. I mean, she's kissed House on the cheek, said, I can't be with you, but, you were the one that got away. Like, those are big words to end a conversation on. You don't just ignore those. Yeah. But
we now head into the very depressing final suite of scenes with House trying to walk again.
Which this scene can be read two ways, I guess. Like, this scene can be shown like, House tries to take a step and he fails. And you could read it as it's a scene demonstrating what House has lost. And I guess, having Stacey around the whole episode is just further evidence on that it's an episode about what House has lost. But you could also read it in a more hopeful way, as we've done many times, which is that at the very least, like, even though House is taking a step, he's taking a step as if he wants to be the person he used to be. And even though he can't do it, at least he's trying now.
And that CGI tablet, that capsule of Vicodin slung into his mouth.
Yeah, well, the show keeps up its love of CGI right to the end. And House throwing a pill in the air and then catching it in his mouth. Very symbolic. After, he's tried to take that step, we then see him kind of like, going back to the drugs, which is a great moment. but I feel in hindsight is possibly ruined by how obviously CGI that tablet is. You know, it goes very well with the music, but I really kind of wish it hadn't have been in there, because for such a powerful scene, it's really ages it and makes it incredibly corny to see this horribly rendered tablet flying through the air. And I know that they couldn't have filmed a tablet going through the air. That would be insanely difficult to do. You'd have to get a whole line of cameras all the way up the tablet's arc, and you'd have to take hundreds of shots per second of it. It would be insane. But
wow.
It's I see why they CGI'd it, and I can see why in the day it looked good, but I really do think it ages that last moment. It's a shame because it's such a big moment in the series.
Yeah, I guess so. That good old Vicodin. So I guess moving on to final thoughts.
Yeah, because you see this episode, and I hadn't really thought about it, but I kind of agree, because it kind of hits its dramatic peak in the last episode, that you think of this as a bit of an epilogue.
Yeah, I think this is... Although, I think you could definitely see... Because the climax happens in 3 stories, in my opinion. In the sense that we confront House's origins, so to speak. Big, gigantic scare quotes on that. And that to me seems like the moment where you go, okay, we get the character, we get what happened, we get the notions of change and stasis that kind of revolve around his life. So I think of this as kind of, it is an epilogue in some ways. It's the introduction of Stacey properly. But in other ways, I just feel it's like an epilogue to set up for season 2, rather than a kind of dramatic part of the dramatic arc of season 1, which was about stasis and change. But then again, there's so much, as we've been talking about this episode, I've seen that there's actually a lot of progression as well. There's a lot of bits and pieces that are put in place. So I'm inclined to still call it an epilogue in that respect, because it does try and shore up and tie up these bits and pieces. But in other ways, it feels like a bit more of a continuation of the arc than I was willing to admit beforehand. So, but I'm still inclined towards epilogue over kind of finale.
I can totally see how you feel that, because most seasons end on such a big moment, and I think 3 stories feels so big for moments of character growth, just mysteries being solved, drama. It's got all the big things that you'd usually expect to be reserved for a finale. So I kind of like that I see why you think it feels like an epilogue. And I do like that they went for that tone in the last one, that the last episode isn't about big moments. It's just about kind of just winding the characters down.
Yeah.
Seeing how they've changed, seeing what they've learned. And it does Stacey and Housey, but it pulls out a lot of other threads. It pulls out it pulls out
Cameron.
House and Cameron's story. It really does fold up a lot of the little mysteries and a lot of the little storylines. And it's and as you say, we can read this as sort of a final resolution of the character, even if there wasn't a season 2. So I totally get the epilogue thing, and I like that the finale feels like that. More than a big bombastic 3 stories where we end on a cliffhanger of Stacey is coming to the hospital next year. How will House react?
Yeah.
Which it could have been. You could have had Honeymoon as the season opener of season 2, which would have been really irritating.
Yes, it would have been.
Because you wouldn't get that completion. I like that the show doesn't cheat you out of resolution just to keep you on a cliffhanger and keep you engaged for season 2. It shows a lot of respect.
Yeah, respect for the audience, I think. Just saying, we're going to just slow things down. We're going to lower the temperature, I guess is another metaphor you could use. I don't want to mix them up too much.
No, absolutely.
Just get things to a point where if you were an audience member, you'd feel like, okay, there are resolutions here. This can be viewed in a self-contained way. And yeah, I think it does that really, really well. I mean, I wouldn't call it the best or one of the best episodes of the season, but I'd say that it fulfills its role really well, which is to basically, as you say, wind down the series. And if it's not renewed, at least provide resolution and then give us, the audience, a feeling of how things might go into the future, that we can imagine the characters in a different way. I think obviously they take a different direction and a different tone in season 2. Obviously, portraying House living happily ever after, or as happily ever after as he can, would be a bit of a bummer. So at least it has some questions. It introduces the new big baddie / goodie / what? Whatever that character is.
Yeah.
So that's that is my final word on that episode, really.
That's fair.
What do you think?
I do think this is one of my favourite episodes. Not of the season, but the whole show. I think it because it feels like so integral to the arc that 3 stories sets up. It's this really nice 2-parter. So I can't really separate them that much. So for that reason, I really like Honeymoon, because it just I like Honeymoon a lot, mostly on the strength, because with the medical mystery, like Mark's medical mystery is interesting because it's so confusing, but it's not like one of those crazy high concept ones, and I wouldn't say that Mark is a particularly interesting character to explore. He's interesting because of his place in the conflict, but I think it really is such a strong episode because of Stacey being there, and like how her performance, and like the dialogue between her and House is just really well written. It's not like, it feels like 2 people talking who are trying to resolve a conflict. It doesn't feel cringy or tacky, and I really appreciate that. I like 2 people trying to resolve their differences, and I quite like how low key it is, and how it's more focused on like the patient drama and the growth of House, which it does at the same time because they're so intertwined. But it's I just like it. I just think it's really well written and has really good drama, and it really has a lot of resolution to it. Very low key resolution, which I enjoy watching. And I like how much it complements 3 stories as well, because 3 stories is my favorite one, but this just complements it so well that it like has a place there as a very good episode. But
I think we respectfully disagree with each other in a way that's actually constructive, which is great.
There you go.
Because I just don't see it that way. I think it has all those.
You just don't like romances and like drama and conversations.
Right? Yeah, of course.
High quality dialogue.
Just a dumb consumer.
Yeah, you like the ones where there's like, oh, what's going to happen next? What's the disease?
I like it when I kind of put in little audio cues where there should be like zing and air horns whenever House.
Yeah, you like the ones where Wilson explains. That's why you like Pilot so much, because you like Wilson going, House is feeling sad now.
Yeah. Oh,
that's your favourite.
Unbelievable scenes here.
No, interesting that we disagree on that, since we often strive for the same.
I guess I'm cancelled for season 2 then. I'm just not going to be renewed. My contract's not going to be renewed for this disagreement.
You're out. I'll have to find some other House fan who wants to talk about House 15 years after the fact. All right, you're rehired. There's no one else.
Oh, fantastic. Glad to be of service. I want more money for this now. Now I know there's no one else.
Jesus Christ. You can have double your salary of free.
Oh, I think that seems reasonable to me. I'll take it.
Well, thank you very much to anyone who's listening. You have now listened to people talking about House Season 1 longer than you've ever watched House Season 1, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, I do know there's a few people who have stuck with us through season 1, which is very nice, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I feel like the podcast has gotten better, but that could just be wishful thinking.
Yeah.
But we're going to round off the last few episodes of our version of season 1 now that we're at the end of House MD season 1. We're going to have an episode talking about our favorite episodes, which obviously will differ by the sounds of it, on Thursday, and then same time as next week for the main entries, we're going to do a sort of full season 1 roundup.
Yeah.
Where we talk about season 1 in general, like what it's achieved, how it's done, kind of put it in one place where we can talk about it for an hour instead of, it being spread across dozens of hours of podcasts. So, but yeah, if you're any interested in the episode breakdowns, thank you very much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed them. And yeah, we'll round off the series. We'll take a few weeks and then it's on to season 2.
Whoop, whoop.
Very exciting. But as always, thank you very much for listening. And yeah, if you want to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, anything like that, then yep, happily, that would be very helpful if you can give us a review of your thoughts and feelings. And or if not, you can get in touch with us at HouseMDcast on Twitter. Just let us know your thoughts or anything like that. But once again, thank you very much from me for listening.
You're thanking yourself for listening. Wow.
No, thank you very much from me for listening.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much from me for you taking the time to listen.
And I guess thank you.
Gaz is also very appreciative.
Very appreciative. Very appreciative.
I'll see you in the next episode, everyone.
All right, see ya.